So, without more ado, Malcolm, I want to begin really at the beginning with the very moving and intense and painful case study that acts as a kind of bookend to Talking to Strangers, which is the case of Sandra Bland and what happened to her in 2015. Can you tell us about that case and how it became so important to your work on this book?
Mm-hmm. Well, there were, prior to George Floyd, there was a few years ago, 3 years ago or so, 4 years ago now, there were a string of cases involving young African Americans and law enforcement in the United States that, beginning with the Michael Brown case in Ferguson, Missouri, which was the first kind of, that really set the stage for what we've seen in the last year in America, where people were sort of brought attention to this endemic problem between this group and and law enforcement. And of that string of cases 4 years ago, there was one involving a young woman named Sandra Bland, who was in a small town in Texas applying for a job. She was from Chicago, and she gets pulled over by a police officer for no particularly good reason, made up a reason. They get into an argument. The police officer arrests her, pulls her from her car, puts her in jail, and she commits suicide 2 days later. And I always thought it was one of the most poignant of all of those cases. And it's also a particularly moving and enraging case because, unlike many of these cases, we have the entire encounter between her and the police officer captured on the police officer's video camera, and his dash camera of his car. So we know exactly what happened between them. There's no disputing the facts, as there normally is in these cases. And that allowed me, I was interested in this general problem of conversations that go awry between strangers. And this was such a kind of overwhelming example of what I was talking about that I decided to structure my book around the attempt to understand, break down what happened in that interaction. So,
again, one of the, I think, most striking features of the book, and your one of the things you do so brilliantly in your writing is combine familiar things with nuggets and anecdotes of completely unexpected information and case studies. But there are quite a lot of stories in Talking to Strangers which are notionally, at least, very familiar and worked through and we know about. And you bring a completely new perspective to them. And I guess one of the examples of that, almost at the extreme, is one that's sort of etched into history, which is the question that is often answered and never really satisfactorily answered, but often asked and not necessarily satisfactorily answered. But I think you do offer an answer. Is why did Churchill, who hadn't met Hitler, so better understand Hitler than Neville Chamberlain, who had?
Yeah. Well, there are many reasons why Churchill got Hitler right and Chamberlain didn't. I mean, among others, that Churchill was a good deal shrewder as a judge of human nature than Chamberlain was. What I was struck by was the fact that if you look at the world leaders in the late 30s who got Hitler wrong, they were overwhelmingly people who had met him on more than one occasion. And if you look at the group of those who didn't get Hitler wrong, who saw him for who he truly was, they were not entirely, but overwhelmingly people who'd never met him. And to my mind, that raises this question of whether, are we sure if we're trying to get to the bottom of a stranger, a face-to-face meeting helps us? Is it possible it might hurt us? So that's what I was trying to explore. I don't think, and I think it's fairly plain, that if you read accounts of Chamberlain's meeting with Hitler, it did not improve his understanding of Hitler to beat him. On the contrary, he fell under Hitler's spell. And so, by the way, did William Lyon Mackenzie King, the Prime Minister of Canada, who met Hitler and just came away so blown away and enraptured with him. I mean, there's a list of these leaders who they encounter the man and it is not by accident that Hitler rose as far and fast as he did. He was someone possessed of enormous charisma. And being charismatic is not the same thing as being decent or truthful and I think as human beings we have difficulty navigating that distinction, that we meet someone and because we warm to them and see evidence of their brilliance or what have you, or we were inclined to believe them. And I think that's what happens with Chamberlain, and that's what Churchill was prevented against. He was never had that confusing moment of being dazzled by Hitler's charisma. He was free to make a decision about him on the basis of the facts, right? Whereas Chamberlain, when he comes back from meeting Hitler in Munich, he's talking about how Hitler looked him in the eye and the strength of his handshake and the tea and
double handshake and
and strudel they had. I mean, it was just he was just off on some kind of, and I think I don't mean to single out Chamberlain. I think that's a real problem we have with strangers, is we overprivilege the information gathered from a face-to-face encounter.
Well, that's an interesting thing because contact theory is very prevalent now. The idea that really what you need to do in a disaggregated and polarized society is just bring people together, and people often quote the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland and so on and the South African experience and so on as absolutely the gold standard of this. But one of the lessons of your book I took away was this really interesting concept of what you call faulty translation. Mm-hmm. Can you explain what that is and why it's so important?
Yeah, we have a baseline assumption. I mean, there's a number of problems in communication that I identify in the book, but you're referring to this problem with what I call the transparency problem, which is we have a baseline assumption as human beings that other people's emotions, other people's inner emotional states can be read by looking at external cues. I can tell whether you're happy by looking at your face and seeing whether you're smiling. I can tell whether you're anxious by looking at your body language. We all have versions of this. There's an endless number of versions of this.
We're all players looking for tells.
Yes, the tells. And we're, as human beings, extraordinarily confident in our ability to read these signs. And we really do think we know when someone doesn't like us, or when someone's lying to us, or when something. And every time psychologists try to verify this intuition and try and figure out, okay, well, do we actually know when we're being lied to? Are you an accurate judge about whether the person you're talking to is happy or sad or anxious or deceitful or what have you? And the answer is that we're not. There's almost nothing that has been studied more in social psychology than the accuracy of our judgments. And overwhelmingly, the answer is, we're terrible at this. You might as well just guess. Our ability, for example, to spot liars is a tiny bit better than chance. And that's only because there's a very small subsection of people who are such extravagantly terrible liars that it's impossible to get them wrong. If you take those people out, it's basically a coin flip.